Okay, Daniel chapter 4, and this is, I think, a pretty interesting chapter. So let's begin with chapter 4, verse 1. Well, actually, I have a question, and that is, and I don't know that you'll know the answer, but here's the question. Are verses 1 and 2 something? Can I just call him King Nebi? Nebuchadnezzar, King Nebi. In other words, what he's going to say in chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, is that because of what happened in chapter 3? Or is this like an introduction to chapter 4? In other words, is he going to share it's kind of like a personal testimony of his faith in the Lord? And so he starts out saying these words of praise, and then he goes on to explain why he's telling these words. So let me read chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. Before I do that, anyone have a thought on what I just asked?
I would have just said it was because of God saving those people. That miracle that he just saw.
Yeah, and that's a possibility. But I didn't know if someone might have listened to John MacArthur and had opinion.
He has a different idea?
I don't know. I didn't read John MacArthur on this one. So, okay. So it says in chapter 4, verse 1, I, Nebuchadnezzar, the king, to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language that live in all the earth, may your peace abound. It has seemed good to me to declare the signs and wonders which the Most High God has done for me. So, by the way, when it says that live in all the earth, that's probably a way of speaking to all those in the world, the Semitic world, because at that time he had defeated the Egyptians and others so forth. So he was the greatest king of that period. It doesn't mean in the entire world. I'm pretty sure that's not what we're to understand there. But here's, some would say, okay, this is following chapter 3, where he saw the miracles, that these 3 Hebrew boys or young men were not killed in the furnace. But it says, signs and wonders which the Most High God has done for me. So others suggest this is kind of the beginning of his testimony, and now he's going to share what God has done for him. So it could be either way. I kind of lean towards the idea that this is the beginning of his testimony, and now he's going to share with us what God has done for him. And here's one of the reasons why. Look at chapter 4, verse 34. And it says there, by the end of that period, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my reason returned to me. And I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. And then it says, for his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. Now, if you go back and look at chapter 4, verse 3, it says in the last couple of lines in that verse, his kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. It's almost identical. So that kind of makes me think that he's beginning with praise to the Lord. He's ending the story with praise to the Lord. So I'm not real sure where the majority of scholars would land, but I think probably they would say that chapter 4, verses 1 and 2 serves as an introduction for what God's going to do in his life. So, the king speaks highly of the Lord God at the end of chapter 3, but he's not really humbled himself. But in chapter 4, he's going to be humbled. So, question or comment before we go on to, let's see, I just read verse 3. Now here's something else that's very unusual about this chapter. Daniel may have framed the wording of the decree. We don't know how much Daniel was involved in all this. But this chapter is unique because this is composed under the authority of a pagan. Unless you want to say, well, he became a believer in the true God, so he wasn't really a pagan. But in a sense, he was a pagan king, even if he did come to faith in the true God. So it's a little unusual. I don't know of another chapter like this, where a king, a pagan king, came up with something, composed a chapter in the Bible. All right, so he was the most powerful king of the ancient Near East at that time. His word was the final authority. That's why he's expressed as having the gold head in the earlier vision, and I believe it's in chapter 2 of the statue, and he's the gold head. He had greater authority. The laws of the Medes and Persians, a king had to be careful that he went by those laws, but the king of Babylon did not have to be so careful. So Daniel's interpretation of the dream about the great image portrayed the world empires, and from that, Nebuchadnezzar learned that the God of Daniel knew mysteries that no other God knew. And then from the deliverance of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, it was clear that the God of Daniel and these Jews could do something that no other God could do. And now he's going to find out something else about this God. He's going to be humiliated, and he will learn that he has to depend upon the true God if he's going to continue to reign. So chapter 4, verse 3, I think we may have already read this, but we'll go ahead and read it again. How great are his signs, and how mighty are his wonders. Maybe we didn't read that part. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. So I believe again, I think he's writing this from the perspective that he's already experienced this humiliation. And now he's convinced that God alone is the source of power. And the only reason he has authority is because of the true God who allows him to have it. Okay, question or comment before we go on to chapter 4, verses 4 and 5. Okay, it says there, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream and it made me fearful. And these fantasies as I lay on my bed and the visions in my mind kept alarming me. So in the next few verses, we'll find out what the dream is about. But at this time in his kingdom, apparently most of his foes had been defeated. Whatever foes remained were kind of, they were behaving because they didn't want him to come and conquer them like he conquered everyone else. But he's having this dream, and it's disturbing to him. Again, I see this as God working in his heart and in his mind. It's believed that these events that are going to be described took place about 573 BC, or pardon me, some 8 or 9 years before 573 BC, because that's when the end of the siege of Tyre took place. So some would say this was from about 582 to 575. And again, it's hard to be absolutely certain when these 7 years were, but from the study of history, this is the suggestion. Okay, if there's no comment or question, let's go on to verse 6. So I gave orders to bring into my presence all the wise men of Babylon, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. Then the magicians, the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners came in, and I related the dream to them, but they could not make its interpretation known to me. He even told them the substance of the dream. It says, I related the dream to them. They still would not come up with any suggestions as to what the dream meant. So then he turned to Daniel. And by the way, maybe they had a good idea what the dream meant, but they didn't want to say it. And that's another possibility. So here's the dream. Well, it says in verse 8, finally Daniel came in before me, whose name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And I related the dream to him, saying, now if you have some different translation, I'm reading from the New American Standard Updated. Different translations may have different ways of translating some words here. The New King James Version, I don't know if anyone's using that. It says, in him is the spirit of the holy God. Well, now I just looked at several versions. The Contemporary Jewish Bible says, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, like the New American Standard Updated. What about the King James? Well, the King James says, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. So I think we may have talked about this a time before. This portion of the Bible is in Aramaic, and there is in Hebrew what's called the majestic plural. And this is often used in reference to the true God, but it's the majestic plural. So the word God in Hebrew is Elohim. That's a plural in Hebrew. It doesn't mean that God is multiple beings. There is one God. But the Elohim is it's called a majestic plural, a plural of respect. And again, in Hebrew language, if you want to talk, if you're a servant, you want to talk about your master, and you want to say he's the best master, just the epitome of what a master should be, you would refer to him in the plural. He is my master's. He would be in the singular. My masters would be in the plural. That's the plural of majesty, the plural of respect. But it's also possible, of course, the word God used in the plural could refer to gods in the plural, many gods. So the question is here, and the reason the translations differ a little bit is, well, is this recognition on the part of Nebuchadnezzar that this is the spirit of the holy God, capital S, capital H, capital G? That's the New King James Version. Or is this in the lips of a pagan king? He's saying Daniel has the spirit of the holy gods, plural, because there's evidence that he believed in more than one God. And so it's a difficult question. There is a reason to think that the word gods here is in the plural in chapter 4, verse 5, and also in chapter 4, verse 8. I think this phrase is used there too.
But I mean, when he says he's named after the name of one God.
Yeah, so he has a God, which I think would probably be Bel. There was more than one God, more than one God that he had.
My Bible says it was probably the title for the god Marduk.
Marduk, yeah.
Bel, which means Lord, was the title for the god Marduk.
That's a good explanation. Yeah. And also, if this was in reference to the God of Israel and it was a majestic plural, the word holy would be in the singular. Because the word holy, I believe, would be an indication that this is in reference to the true God, and it's a majestic plural. But the word holy in the Aramaic is in the plural. So that's another reason to think this is the spirit of the holy gods. You still hadn't got it all figured out yet. That's my opinion. I think the majority of scholars would see it that way. Another question, comment about this? Okay. Let's go on to chapter 4, verse 9. O Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, since I know that a spirit of the holy gods, there it is again, is in you, and no mystery baffles you, tell me the visions of my dream which I've seen, along with its interpretation. Now these were the visions in my mind as I lay on my bed. I was looking, and behold, there was a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew large and became strong, and its height reached to the sky, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth. Its foliage was beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the sky dwelt in its branches, and all living creatures fed themselves from it. And so this is the substance of his dream. And let's pick up at verse 13. As I was looking in the visions in my mind, as I lay on my bed, behold, an angelic watcher, a holy one, descended from heaven. He shouted out and spoke as follows: chop down the tree and cut off its branches, strip off its foliage and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts flee from under it and the birds from its branches. Yet leave the stump with its roots in the ground, but with a band of iron and bronze around it, in the new grass of the field. And let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him share with the beast in the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let a beast's mind be given to him, and let 7 periods of time pass over him. So he's got this very beautiful, happy scene of this wonderful tree, and then this angel comes down, ordering it to be chopped down, and only the stump of the tree was spared, and it was to be encircled with bands of iron and bronze and remain in the grassy meadow. And at this point, the symbolic language indicates that the mind of the stump was to be changed, that of a man to that of a brute beast. And the word mind here is the word for heart. And normally in the Hebrew language and Aramaic too, in the Old Testament, the heart refers to the center of the will, the emotions, the intellect, where you make your choices, your mental processes. This is the mind or the heart of a person. And he's going to be under this curse, if you want to call it that, for 7 periods of time, and scholars are pretty much in agreement at 7 years. And then chapter 4, verse 17, the sentence is by the decree of the angelic watchers, and the decision is a command of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind, and bestows it on whom he wishes, and sets over it the lowliest of men. So this passage is affirming that God is fully sovereign. Now again, I don't claim to understand, God had his reasons for allowing Nebuchadnezzar to come to power, and then the nation of Judah was under judgment for their rebellion against God. And God used Nebuchadnezzar to bring judgment on them. And now God will bring some judgment on Nebuchadnezzar to lead him to repent. But again, I don't claim to understand all this about God's sovereignty. And we talked about this some in the morning message. We may have talked about it in the Bible study at Sunday school too, that I don't understand sometimes why God allows some things to happen. It's difficult. But unless there's a comment or question, let's go on to verse 17. Oh no, we just read that. So let's move on to verse 19. Then Daniel, whose name is Belteshazzar, was appalled for a while as his thoughts alarmed him. The king responded and said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its interpretation alarm you. Belteshazzar replied, my lord, if only the dream applied to those who hate you in its interpretation to your adversaries. The tree that you saw, which became large and grew strong, whose height reached to the sky and was visible to all the earth, and whose foliage was beautiful and its fruit abundant, and in whom was food for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and in whose branches the birds of the sky lodged, it is you, O king. For you have become great and grown strong, and your majesty has become great and reached to the sky, and your dominion to the end of the earth. Now you can see here that Daniel is reluctant to share the interpretation of this dream with him. And I don't think at all that Daniel's afraid of him. I think Daniel is grieved of what's going to happen to him. On the other hand, what's going to happen to him is going to be for his good. So again, this is part of the mystery of the sovereignty of God. We're grieved at some things that would happen in our lives and the lives of others, but God can use those things for our good. And so Daniel is loyal to him, and I think he remained loyal during the 7 years. Daniel knew that after 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar would be back in power again. It was only going to be for 7 years. So I think in this 7-year period of time, while King Nebu's out in the pasture, so to speak, Daniel is helping to maintain the kingdom, because he knows before long King Nebu will be back again. Now, unless there's a question or comment, we'll move on to verse 23. And in that king saw an angelic watcher, a holy one, descending from heaven and saying, chop down the tree and destroy it, yet leave the stump with its roots in the ground, but with a band of iron and bronze around it in the new grass of the field. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him share with the beasts of the field until 7 periods of time pass over him. This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king, that you be driven away from mankind, and your dwelling place be with the beasts of the field, and you be given grass to eat like cattle, and be drenched with the dew of heaven. And 7 periods of time will pass over you until you recognize that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whomever he wishes. And in that it was commanded to leave the stump with the roots of the tree. Your kingdom will be assured to you after you recognize that it is heaven that rules. Therefore, O king, may my advice be pleasing to you. Break away now from your sins by doing righteousness, and from your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, in case there may be a prolonging of your prosperity. So Nebuchadnezzar was going to lose not only his power to rule, but even his sanity. He was going to be reduced to the mentality of a beast of the field. For 7 years, he was going to be fed on the grass of the meadow, like a bull in a herd of cattle. And this would teach him God's sovereignty. Nebuchadnezzar had to learn that the one true God was the God Daniel worshiped, and not Marduk or one of these other gods. Now, some have criticized Daniel chapter 4 based on an archaeological find. In 1952, in the Qumran cave, that's where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, an Aramaic fragment of a prayer of thanksgiving attributed to Nabonidus was discovered. And this is what it said, according to one of the translators. The words of the prayer which Nabonid, king of Assyria and Babylon, the great king, prayed when he was smitten with an unpleasant skin disease by the ordinance of God Most High in the city of Tema. I was smitten with an unpleasant skin disease for 7 years, he said. But when I confessed my sins and my faults, he granted me a favorable verdict. And there was a Jew from somewhere, it's not legible there. And he wrote and told me to give honor to the name of God Most High. To some extent, this was a conjectural translation. When the fragment was first published, many critics assumed the story of Nebuchadnezzar was really the story about Nabonidus, and that somehow the story had been garbled, and the incorrect story was that in the book of Daniel. But there's good reason to think this story is either one of two possibilities. Either it's a story about, by the way, Nabonidus reigned after Nebuchadnezzar. So either this story was a different story about a different king, who was a Babylonian king, or another possibility is the story about Nabonidus was garbled and was actually a story about Nebuchadnezzar. And I think that's most likely, but either one is a possibility. And here's some reason to think that, in other words, I want to share with you some of the differences between this story that they found in the Qumran cave and what we have in the book of Daniel. Nabonidus' skin disease was far less serious than Nebuchadnezzar's insanity. You know, if I had to have one or the other, I'd much rather have a skin disease. I mean, yeah, it's bad, but not as bad as losing your mind. Here's the second thing. The locus, in other words, where this took place was, according to Daniel chapter 4, it was in Babylon, and not in this place called Tema. That's another difference. Here's another difference in the story. The Jewish counselor is said to have written a letter to Nabonidus. Daniel gave this information personally to Nebuchadnezzar. All right, here's another difference. The scope of Nabonidus' authority is said to have included Assyria. This would have been an unhistorical feature at the time of Nebuchadnezzar. And it's believed that this is evidence that this was, the story about Nabonidus was not really correct because of that addition of the mention of Assyria. But again, it's difficult to know. So again, there's a possibility that this story about Nabonidus actually happened, but that doesn't mean the story about Nebuchadnezzar is wrong. And I think it's more likely either it's a garbled story about Nebuchadnezzar or it's just a different story altogether. But there's no reason to say this story didn't happen because of that. All right, I hope you don't mind I spend a few moments on that. That's just one of the scholars some like to criticize the Bible. Okay, so Verse 26 closes the interpretation with the prediction: the surviving tree stump, he'll be preserved during the 7 years, and then he will be restored. This is really unusual, because usually when a king has something like this happen to him, someone else steps up to the throne, and he doesn't come back into power, even if his sanity is restored. But the person who would follow him is called Evil Merodach or Amal Marduk. He was either not old enough at this time to take power, or he was unsuitable for some reason. And I think it's likely, again, that Daniel and probably one of the queens worked with Daniel. Trying to remember her name, Amatice or something. I think they probably worked together to be sure that his Nebuchadnezzar was not killed or something during this period of time. But in all of this, Daniel needed real courage, and he followed his interpretation with a sermon. And basically he said, in essence, you need to re-examine your life and in light of the moral law, and you need to show a new sensitivity to the plight of the poor. So for Nebuchadnezzar, it was all about himself, how wonderful he was, what a great king he was. And Daniel's telling him, you need to get your heart right, in essence. So God spares Nebuchadnezzar for a year, and then apparently, Nebuchadnezzar stops paying any attention to what the message was, and this is where we'll pick up at verse 28. And I think I'll show you here. This is a reconstruction of what's called the Gate of Ishtar. This is in, I believe, in Germany, but it's an actual reconstruction. If this was what it looked like, I think they faithfully did the reconstruction. In other words, I'm just trying to show a little bit of his work as a builder, as to why he thought so highly of himself. Of course, he had people do the work. And here's the following symbolized the god Marduk. It was a dragon. Mashashu, I think is the way you say that word. Now, whether this was actually something that existed or something that they imagined, I'm not real sure. In other words, they had these different creatures on some of the walls and on the Ishtar gate. Ishtar, by the way, was a goddess, Ishtar. So here's another, this is a picture of the sacred animal of the god Adad. It's called Arak. It's a now extinct ancestor of cattle. So that was Adad, also known as Ishkur. I think that may be the last picture, yeah. So, but it's quite remarkable that we have some of these, some of these monuments and so forth that he built to himself. So, and he talks about in some of his writings that have existed about some of his great things that he's done. In one of his inscriptions, it says, the fortifications of the temple of Marduk in Babylon I strengthen and establish the name of my reign forever. So that's outside the scripture. So we see he's got this boastful attitude. And then he appended a prayer to Marduk on one of his inscriptions. And it says, O Marduk, Lord of the gods, my divine creator, may my deeds find favor before thee. Thou art indeed my deliverer and my help, O Marduk. By thy faithful word, which does not change, may my weapons advance, be sharp, and be stronger than the weapons of the foe. And he also composed a hymn. Again, this is extra biblical literature the archaeologists have uncovered. Here's a hymn that when he became enthroned as king, he wrote this humble petition to Marduk. I am the prince who obeys thee, the creation of thy hand. Thou art my creator, and the sovereignty over the host of men thou hast entrusted to me, and so forth. So you can see that he truly was a pagan earlier, but he turned his heart to God in this chapter. Can we chase a rabbit for just a moment? Because I think this rabbit's worth catching and eating. You ever had rabbits before? Anyone? Some of you have. Nancy, you've had rabbit stew before. Yeah. Don't you remember? Oh no, we'll talk about it later. Anyway. So, in Isaiah chapter 14, verse 4, this was written before the time of Nebuchadnezzar. It says, Isaiah 14:4, you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon and say, all right? I think chapter 14, verse 4 likely refers to Nebuchadnezzar. If not, then it's some other king of Babylon, because that's what it says in chapter 14, verse 4. You will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon. Now, if you go down to Isaiah 14:12, this is part of what it says. How you have fallen from heaven, O star of the morning. Now, some translations will translate that as Lucifer. And they will base that on the Latin translation called the Vulgate, which translates the word there as Lucifer. But look, basically, it's not necessarily a name for Satan. It became a name for Satan. But really, it means more like the morning star. And that's why the newer translations will translate it. That's chapter 14, verse 12. O star of the morning. You have been cut down. Remember, in chapter 14, verse 4, it says this is about the king of Babylon. Okay? I know this is a popular view that Lucifer is a name for Satan. And if you want to believe it, it's okay. But just keep in mind in chapter 14, verse 4, it says this is about the king of Babylon. And it says there, you've been cut down to earth, you've weakened the nations, but you said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven, I will raise my throne above the stars of God, and I will sit on the mount of assembly in the resources of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, I will make myself like the Most High. Nevertheless, you will be thrust down to Sheol to live in the recesses of the pit. This may be a description prophetically of King Nebuchadnezzar, how he was so lifted up about himself, and yet he's going to be thrust down, and Sheol could be a figurative way of saying, you're going to be humbled as you graze on the fields. Those who see you, verse 16, Isaiah 14:16, those who see you will gaze at you, they will ponder over you, saying, is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms, who made the world like a wilderness and overthrew its cities, who did not allow his prisoners to go home? So perhaps as he's out there in the field grazing out to lunch, so to speak, for 7 years, people are just looking at, is this the person who conquered the world? Is this really him? So could this refer to Satan? Well, I think it could. But keep in mind in chapter 14, verse 4, Isaiah, it says, pardon me, you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon. So this is definitely, I'm just trying to take the Bible, for what it's saying. This is definitely the king of Babylon that's in view. Now, it could refer to Satan in some way as well. But, so anyway, I just thought you might find that interesting. He was Nebuchadnezzar was the mightiest king of Babylon. So we'll move on from there unless there's a question, comment. To verse 31, chapter 4, verse 31 of Daniel. So the king is out there, he's thinking about how wonderful he is, all that he's done. It says in verse 31, while the word was in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven saying, King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared, sovereignty has been removed from you, and you will be driven away from mankind. And your dwelling place will be with the beasts of the field. You will be given grass to eat like cattle, and 7 periods of time will pass over you until you recognize that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whomever he wishes. He thought the reason he was the most powerful king in the world was because of himself. God's telling him, no. I allowed you to be, you became this king because of my work, not because of your own. And you need to understand that. So verse 33 says, immediately the word concerning Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled, and he was driven away from mankind and began eating grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair had grown like eagle's feathers and his nails like bird's claws. So it's ironic, he did little to help the lowest people in his kingdom, and now he would become the lowest himself, eating grass out in the field. So he became like a brute beast. His skin toughened as he was out there in the field, the sun shining on it. This is in modern day Iraq, where this took place. In the summer there, the temperature can get up to 110, 120 degrees. It can be well below freezing in the winter. He's out there, his hair is growing long. It's like the feathers of an eagle. And of course, he's not trimming his fingernails, so they're growing long. And that's the picture we have here. Now you may say, this really sounds strange. It does sound strange. It's also something that has a name because it still occurs with people today. It's very seldom that this happens, but this is called boanthropy. Boanthropy. It comes from the word bo, which means bull, and anthropos, which is the word for man in Greek. Boanthropy. It's where a person has a mental illness or some demonic work in his life. It's hard to know which for sure, but most would say it's a mental illness, where a person actually thinks they're a bull. There's another, sometimes this is referred to as lycanthropy, where a person thinks they have become a wolf. And a scholar named, I'm trying to remember his name, it'll come to me in a moment. Yeah, R.K. Harrison. When I found it in my notes, that's when it came to me. He was a professor at the University of Toronto in Canada. And in 1946, he says, I saw an instance of lycanthropy in a mental institution in Great Britain. And he describes how the man looked and how he acted. He thought he was a cow, and he lived like a cow. He slept outside. The guards in the mental institution let him have the grounds, and he ate grass, and his hair grew long, And W.A. Griswold said that's where the hippies come from. I don't agree with that, but anyway.
I
So,
thought you said lycanthropy was a wolf.
yes, but sometimes this, instead of using the word boanthropy, they just use the word lycanthropy. It's where someone who thinks they're wolf, and it's kind of like they think they're an animal. So the two are kind of lumped together as mental problems. So,
Well, do you know if that happens today or in the past, other than to Nebuchadnezzar, do people ever get over it, or is that them for the rest of their life?
that's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. I haven't done that much study of it. I just know that it is something that happens. It's very rare from what I understand. That's a great question. That's worthy of study. So one writer from a speech at Exeter University wrote this in 1999. He said, "Boanthropy was what supposedly happened to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, who, according to the Bible, spent 7 years living as a cow. As another scholar named Davidson pointed out, the records of ancient Babylon do not tell us anything of the sort. No such telltale phrase as, 'O king, live forever, I brought you some nice hay.' Nothing of the sort. There's merely an interval in the records during which Nebuchadnezzar is not recorded as doing anything at all. And this interval lasts for 7 years. Very interesting," he says. So the king was not boasting. I mean, I've shared some of the other stuff we've seen. Extra biblical, he was boasting, when he wasn't praising his pagan gods. In the Bible, he's boasting about himself. But for 7 years, he's not boasting about himself. Why not? Well, I think we have the reason here in Daniel chapter 4. Question or comment before we move on? And don't worry, we're getting close to the end. Chapter 4, verse 34. "But at the end of that period, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my reason returned to me." His sanity returned to me. He said, "And I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, but he does according to his will in the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of earth, and no one can ward off his hand or say to him, 'What have you done?'" Now, God was teaching Nebuchadnezzar something. He brought judgment on Nebuchadnezzar. But whenever there's judgment, there's also God's grace present. And after 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar came to realize that he needed to be humbled. And the God of Israel was the true God. And I think we see here a genuine turning in faith to the true God of Israel. Now, that doesn't mean that he got everything worked out theologically. I've met Christians I don't think have everything worked out theologically. I'm thinking about myself when I say that. So here's something else that's very important to understand about this story. The Jewish people were taken into captivity. And yes, they were told by the prophets, this has happened to you because you disobeyed God, you turned away from God, you began to worship pagan idols. But they probably also wondering, is the reason that we've been taken into captivity and so many of us have been killed is because the God of Israel really couldn't protect us? Maybe that's it. And what happened to Nebuchadnezzar was an indication to the Jewish people the sovereign God is actually the God of the Hebrews. And yes, you can trust him. and one day you will be restored. Just as he lost his sanity for 7 years, you're going to be in captivity for 70 years, and then you will be restored. Keep trusting in God in this process. So verse 36, at that time my reason returned to me, and my majesty and splendor were restored to me for the glory of my kingdom. And my counselors and my nobles began seeking me out, so I was reestablished in my sovereignty, and surpassing greatness was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are true, and his ways just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride. So now he came to the realization of that he needed to fear the Lord personally. So, okay.
How did he die?
Pardon?
How did he die?
You know, I'm not real sure. I don't think he died by assassination, as far as I know.
Just wondering, because when you were reading that in Isaiah, on the last verses of that, it was talking about, if, I don't know, it was about that king wasn't buried. And I didn't know if it said what happened to him. Is that what's?
Yeah, let's take a look at that. Isaiah 14.
Yeah, 14, 18.
Yeah, I'm not real sure how that would be a reference to Nebuchadnezzar, and that's a good question.
Now, I'm looking here at, the end of chapter 4, and now suddenly in chapter 5, we're with King Belshazzar. So, at the end of chapter 4, is that all we hear about Nebuchadnezzar?
You mean in Isaiah?
No, I'm in Daniel.
Oh, well, there might be some reference to him in a way, but you're mentioning of the king who was Belshazzar, the last king of Babylon, along with his father Nabonidus. I wonder if this could be taken then to mean not just King Nebuchadnezzar, but the king who followed him. In other words, the kingdom, the kingship, so to speak, of Babylon. Again, because Belshazzar would be, killed, and I doubt he would be buried, in any kind of solemn way. That's a great question, and I'm going to make note of that. I appreciate you asking.
Belshazzar's mom come in and say, "You should have learned from your grandfather."
Yeah. Yeah.
Who was his grandfather?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks for asking that. Okay, so that's, okay, let's go back to verse 28 for a moment, unless there's a question, and we're almost done. All this happened to Nebuchadnezzar the king. 12 months later, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. Maybe I didn't read this earlier. The king reflected and said, "Is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built, as a royal residence by the might of my power and for the glory of my majesty. While the word was in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven saying, King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared, sovereignty has been removed from you. And then we have the rest of that. I just want to end by saying, this may sound like a very, in other words, I would not want to go through something like this. I don't think you would either. But if this is what I had to go through to come to know the true God, it would be worth it. And sometimes this is what people have to go through, not exactly what he goes through. But they may go into drug addiction, and the list could go on of how they bring, great troubles and trials on their life. But then as they go down to the floor, they meet God and come back up again. And I know people like this, and I have some of this own experience in my own life. But I know of a man who, for like 20 years in California, for 20 years, I think he started using drugs when he was 14 years old. Used them for like 20 years, and he finally ended up in prison. He found the Bible on the floor. I think I've shared this story with you before. Found the Bible on the floor, started reading it, put his faith in the Lord. Today he's pastoring a church in California. And it's just exciting what God has done in his life. So.
Well, a lot in the past, God punished and the people had to take the brunt of the punishment until he finally turned. So in this case, he dealt with the king,
Yep.
and so
Yeah.
kings aren't exempt.
Yeah.
And
Anyway.
who's to say what that influence that had on the people in his kingdom? I mean, to see that, and then he'll come back after the end of it and recognize God for who he was.
Yeah, I don't know how people responded, but I think that's part of what's interesting here is all these people were coming to him, and they saw how this change had taken place in his life. So it was a powerful testimony of the work of God.
Well, yeah, because Daniel stayed in power, I guess, those 7 years, right? He maintained his position. Seemed like that would have been a good time the other people to have gotten rid of Daniel, right?
Yeah.
For not caring for him. For his place to get.
It's interesting. Someone else have a comment or question? Okay, well, let's close with prayer, shall we? Brother Paul, would you lead us?
Father, we thank you for this day, we thank you for the blessings of this and everything. Lord, we thank you for your word.